Deontology sounds great in theory, but is there a way to ground Kant in reality? Enter W.D. Ross. Ross took inspiration from a lot of figures and ultimately concludes a very different version of deontology. We'll specifically go over chapter 2 of The Right and the Good. His position is occasionally called ethical pluralism or deontological pluralism. The three primary influences are Immanuel Kant, G.E. Moore, and Aristotle. From Kant, he took deontology. From Moore, he took non naturalism. And from Aristotle, he took prudence and perception. He opens up this chapter with a narrative of ethical development. At the beginning is egoism, where we're concerned with ourselves and usually just about pleasure. We can summarize this by saying that what is right is whatever produces the most pleasure for me. Utilitarianism is a clear improvement on this system because it solves for the blatantly arbitrary position that I am the only person that matters. So the summarization would only change one word. What is right is whatever produces the most pleasure for all. G.E. Moore likewise changes just one word by saying that pleasure alone is not the only valuable thing. What is right is whatever produces the most good for all. And good includes pleasure, among other things, but is still limited to production or result. This is where Ross steps in and challenges production. Like the previous modifications, he admits that production of the good is one of the things we ought to do, but that we should conceive of that as just one of our responsibilities. So, production is one of our duties, but it is not the only duty. Moore's ethics says, in effect, that the only morally significant relation in which my neighbors stand to me is that of being possible beneficiaries by my action. If I could bring equal amounts of good into being by fulfilling my promise and by helping someone to whom I had made no promise, I should not hesitate to regard the former as my duty. Yet, on the view that what is right because it is productive of the most good, I should not so regard it. This is similar to G.E. Moore's thought experiment against John Stuart Mill. Moore argues that beauty is valuable apart from the pleasure associated with it, because in the scenario where pleasure is equal, we still recognize a beautiful world as better. Ross's version just compares equal production of the good and keeping a promise versus breaking a promise. We intuit that keeping the promise is more ethical and it has nothing to do with production of the good. So, Ross argues that production of the good is just one of our duties, and we have other duties in addition. Ross introduces his duties as prima facie, which literally means at first glance. Also, Latin's a dead language, pronounce that however you want. If anyone were to ask if lying was wrong, Ross would say that, of course, yes, it's wrong. It's against your duties. The issue is when we get someone that says, but what about if breaking the promise allows for a child slave in Africa to break away from his captors and goes on to attend Juilliard to compose the greatest symphony the world will ever have? And then after he goes to be a doctor and cures cancer, and then he runs for Secretary General of the United Nations and first pick a plot line and second stop talking. At first glance means without exceptionally absurd circumstance. Anything can be made right if you throw enough extraordinary variables into the scenario. Promise keeping is the default moral position, and this applies to all of the duties. Ross lists 6 duties in total, and these are all irreducible. Fidelity and reparation concern promise keeping and making up for past offenses. Gratitude concerns honoring a benefactor for the benefits they previously bestowed. Justice is about the distribution of goods to all people regardless of merits. Beneficence is helping strangers, self-improvement is helping yourself, and non-maleficence is specifically not hurting others. That one might seem strange, but Ross considers helping others and not hurting others to be distinct duties, even as they're clearly related. For the record, the duty of beneficence is the only duty of Moore and is otherwise understood in the same way. These duties are not technically exhaustive, but Ross never gives any more. They can be generally understood as follows. Some things are duties because of events in the past, some things are duties because of present circumstances, and some things are duties based on future possible outcomes. This goes without saying, but Ross's prima facie duties are super different from Immanuel Kant. This is even more clear in the method of how to resolve conflicts of duties. We could have a scenario where I could fulfill a duty of self-improvement or a duty of non-maleficence, but not both. Or maybe I made a promise, yet by breaking it, I could also benefit a stranger. Which duty do I follow? Kant's way to resolve the conflict of duties is between a distinction of perfect and imperfect duties, where perfect duties are always superior. Ross's version of this is called special obligations and general obligations. For Ross, no duty is absolutely special, but circumstance makes one duty the more important duty. Differences include no absolute duties, no strict understanding of moral credit, no sensible and intelligible world distinction, no strict position against heteronymous principles, and no focus on an a priori synthetic process. At the same time, it must be said that Ross does think that fidelity, reparation, and gratitude are always special duties, yet these still might be overcome by an even more special circumstance. Since circumstance is admitted to be valuable information for ethics, the question which duty is special can only be resolved by perception, intuition, and being aware of the relevant variables. There is no absolute principle. The only thing I can provide you are examples. Let's say that I make a promise to pick up a friend at a specific time for a trivial purpose. They could walk, but simply don't want to, and I happen to be in the area at the right time. I make the promise that I'll drive them. On my way to pick them up, I witness a particularly horrendous car accident. I can either stop and render aid, which is my duty of beneficence, or I can continue driving to fulfill the duty of fidelity. In this scenario, since the promise was relatively trivial, it seems like the duty of beneficence is special. It is right for me to be late to pick them up. In a similar situation where the car accident is relatively minor, and perhaps there are already other witnesses who have stopped, the promise is special. This is often how actual people, and by that I mean non philosophers, think about what they should do. And for that reason alone, it is often very appealing to my students. Ross admits that this is vague, but his vagueness is supplemented by our experiences in the real world. Ross's method is also applicable to the trolley problem. Immanuel Kant refuses to pull the lever because it's against his absolute duty not to harm anyone, even if it's to save other people. But in a different scenario that requires you to push someone into harm's way, instead of merely pulling a lever, Kant gets to stay consistent in his decision. Ross, however, might argue that the duty of beneficence is special here, even while the duty of non-maleficence is special in the other scenario. There is no absolute duty, so Ross gets flexibility in his version of deontology in comparison to Kant. Thank you for watching.